We're going to continue our work tonight by starting Chapter 2. And Chapter 2 starts with reviewing some of the basic concepts of HTML5 and perhaps teaching you concepts of HTML5 maybe you didn't know before. I'm not really sure. I know that when this book was authored, HTML5 was not a standard as of yet, so it was a new thing and they were trying to prepare people for the future. So I will throw in my own little tidbits where I think there's gaps in the information or where things may have changed over time. All right, well, now I mentioned to you in the previous video that HTML5 became an official standard at the beginning of 2014. The browsers were supporting it well before that time, and I think finally Microsoft has come out with a browser that's actually HTML5 compliant, and that's Microsoft Edge. Although Internet Explorer 10 and 11 did support it, there were some issues with it, and some of the things that you'll do in this book, most specifically adding the Modernizer JavaScript library, helps overcome some of the problems that the older versions of Internet Explorer had. For the most part, I tell students that when we're authoring for the web these days, you can kind of summarily dismiss Internet Explorer, almost, right? There's a couple of circumstances, and the circumstance that I always try to enlighten people about is in a lot of corporate environments where they've done a lot of significant application development, creating applications that were designed to run on Internet Explorer, that they're not going to move away from those products. Gateway has a few products, a few databases that we have here on campus that really only properly work inside of Internet Explorer. As cumbersome as that is, that's just how it is. And chances are you guys might even work in an environment that runs older versions of Windows and older Internet Explorers. When a company's invested millions of dollars in applications and the infrastructure to run them, they don't move away from them quickly, especially if it still works. So that's one thing that I'd like you to keep in the back of your head. All right, let's talk about where we came from and where we are now. HTML, the acronym, and you guys should know this already as indicated right there in the first sentence, stands for Hypertext Markup Language. HTML is not a programming language. It is a markup language whose origins stem from a technology called SGML. It was a technology that was designed to mark up content for prepress. So in the old days, before we had word processors with WYSIWYG interfaces where you could make the text bold and italicize it, make it a heading or indent it or whatever it is, change the fonts. The only methods that we had to do it electronically was we would have plain text and then they would insert tags that look very much like HTML tags around portions of text to mark them as headings and italics and block quotes and things like that. And that's where a lot of the HTML concepts came from. But that markup language eventually became the parent language and the inspiration for languages like HTML and, more importantly, XML, which is really what we call the parent markup language, or the markup language that we use to create other markup languages. So really all the modern markup languages that we use stem from XML as a technology. If you're curious about XML, one site that you should already be aware of, we did this last week too, I know, probably in ASP.NET too, is the W3 Schools site, and all of you should be familiar with this website. But if you're interested about the history or any of that stuff, but if you're more importantly interested about XML, XML is a markup language, and if you just look at it really quickly, it looks kind of like HTML. There's the brackets and there's tags, but you notice the names of the tags are not ones that are predefined. They are tags that you create on your own. You can create whatever tag you want. There's just certain rules you have to follow. Whatever tag you create or open, you have to close. Some of them are self-closing. We do that in HTML2 where the slash is inside the brackets, and some of them are not. But they need to be well structured and they need to be nested. Now, using this technology in combination with a couple of others, we use that to create the doc types for all the other markup languages. If you were to look at the doc type for HTML4, and you look at how that looks, and I'm just kind of zooming in here. So in the old days when we were doing HTML4 and you wanted to do the doc type, and you wanted that doc type to be correct, you'd have to type all of that in, not doc type HTML. You needed that exact URL. And what does that do? Well, it points you to an actual file that's called a DTD. DTD stands for Doc Type Declaration. If you examine that file written in XML format defines the rule set for what each tag should do and how it should behave. With HTML5, they said enough of these complicated doc types, let's make it something that people can remember. So they just switched it to doc type HTML, and that's HTML5. It's just understood by the browser knows where to look for it. In the old days, you would have to declare it very much like this, and there were different formats. Notice that this one says at the very end, strict DTD. Okay, so is there a non-strict one? Oh yeah, there's what we call transitional. So ones that allow you to be sloppy. Isn't that weird? But the interesting thing here, and I think I pointed this out last time in our book, is we see like HTML. What was the version that preceded it? It wasn't 4. 4 did not precede 5. I mean, it did, but it wasn't the standard before 5 became the standard. XHTML was. Why did they come up with that? Well, they came up with XHTML because the previous versions of HTML were too loose. In order for us to be able to use a web browser to really deliver applications, we needed to tighten up the rule sets. Because what was happening, really right up until just a few years ago, we'd get different browser manufacturers, we get different authoring platforms, different versions of HTML, and some people followed the rules, and some people didn't. You know, in the old days of HTML, we didn't have to close tags. We would put in a paragraph tag. You didn't have to close it. They just did it. Isn't that weird? There was only a few tags that we would close, and things would just work. But the truth is, they wouldn't work well, right? We would sit there, we would code things for one browser, we'd take our project to open it up in, Internet Explorer and go, oh my God, it's horribly broken. Take it over to Firefox, it looks great. Over to Chrome, it's like, it's kind of okay, but this part's broken. Have you guys ever experienced stuff like that? It's maddening, right? And the reason is because the rule sets weren't being followed. So they developed XHTML, which took the strictness of XML, where everything that was open must be closed and it must fit a certain format. And by enforcing those rules in the browser and in the writing of the code, we were then able to start to apply CSS and JavaScript that would behave almost the same in every browser. I'm still not saying 100%. There were still differences because the browser manufacturers were saying, well, no, we interpret, border width this way, and you guys interpret padding that way, and things would not behave well between browsers. It was very, very difficult to be a really good web designer in those days because you would spend so much time and then find something horribly broken, right? Or you'll be designing on a PC using Firefox, and along comes your client who's using an old Mac and Safari and getting completely different results. Fortunately, now that we've moved to HTML5 and that the browser manufacturers have all finally said, okay, fine, I'll follow the rules. Really, it was kind of like that. Microsoft really dug their heels in for a long time, and kind of fought it. The browser, if you guys are curious, that was most standards compliant is not Chrome, folks. It's Firefox. And Firefox, I'm going to encourage some of you guys to take a look at that as a tool, mostly from like the inspect element tools and the debugging tools that are built into it. They're a little bit more superior to what Chrome has to offer. So don't don't get into this mindset that only Chrome is the tool you should use. You have to be multi-browser. You have to be looking at all the different platforms as well. A good web designer on their desk will have access, if not to a physical machine, we'll have a Mac, we'll have a PC, we'll have a Linux box, we'll have a Windows 10 machine, a Windows 8 machine, a Windows 10. They'll have all sorts of stuff. Why? Because that's the only way you can really be sure that it's looking right and behaving right. The emulators that are built into browsers, and we will examine those tools, are not always reliable, which you will discover. So please keep that in mind. Now there's a bunch of tags that, interestingly, where some of them went away and then they came back. The bold tag, which is one of the first tags they talk about right up here, and that's one that actually came from SGML, is the bold tag. And we used to use that because that was how we would make text bold. We didn't have CSS in the early days. We would just throw the bold tags in and it would get a little bolder, and we were thrilled. Then they took that away with XHTML in favor of what tag? What tag replaced bold? Strong. And strong is still in use. And then when HTML5 came out, they're like, well, you know, bold's okay. So now you can use both. All right. So that really kind of leads us to a couple of different issues. And one of them is this concept of what we call semantic markup. The movement during the development of HTML5, I can summarize as basically this. In the old days, we would write HTML, and the HTML would do all the work. It would contain the content and the structure of the document. It would also contain the styling elements. In the old days when I learned, it was such a godsend when we had a font tag, right? All of a sudden I could have a font tag. We just never heard of that in HTML, right? But you could color your fonts and put in a different font type, and then you could use your bolds and your italics, and you could kind of make it look like something. And that wasn't really considered good for compatibility, and that's one of the reasons we had all these browser issues. All of a sudden people were like, well, we need style sheets like we have in word processors. But Microsoft did them one way, Netscape, aka Mozilla and Firefox, did it a different way, and every new browser manufacturer that would come out would do it their own way. So it created just a myriad of problems. So what they came up with is like, we have to come up with not only language standards, but this concept where we're going to start to separate, like we do in real applications, where we separate the content and the structure from the styles and the action. So content and structure will be your HTML. So as much as possible, your HTML should really only contain the words and the images and the structure, like whether it's a paragraph or a heading or a block quote. And all the styling elements should be done, all the styling should be done with CSS. And all the behaviors and the actions and the dynamics should all be done with JavaScript. Now there is a blurring between the technologies, no doubt, because like with CSS, I can do dynamic things like I can with JavaScript, and I can also use JavaScript to control appearance, and actually I can still use HTML to control appearance too. But the ideal, folks, is HTML, and this is something you might want to even write down and internalize. HTML is structure and content. CSS is appearance and behavior. JavaScript is the programmability, the doing of something, turning it into an application. Those three technologies separated but working in tandem as separate documents. So we put our CSS in a separate document, we put our JavaScript in a separate document, and HTML. By keeping them separate, we can enforce the standards of HTML, yet give it tremendous power and flexibility to the point where we are writing native operating system applications with it now. That's why it's possible, is because we're following rules. So the reason we got to where we are is because of the semantic markup. Semantic also has a secondary meaning. You know what the meaning of semantic is? Meaning is the meaning of semantic. So in other words, we have a tag, right? If I'm going to put something into a tag called article, maybe it's an article, right? If I put something in a paragraph tag, it's because it's a paragraph. If I put a heading tag on it, it implies that it's a heading for the article. Or if I have an abstract, or if I have a fig caption. These are all tags that you've learned, right? So the point is that the tag indicates what the content is. Because the truth is, I could just put everything inside of a div tag and make it behave any way I want, and that's really what we're trying to break here. So one of the reasons why we, came up with this whole concept, of working with semantic markup is to avoid something like this, right? Where we have a little snippet at this point, or if you don't, I'm going to refresh your memory, that a div is a generic HTML container. It's a generic block level container, meaning that whenever you put that on a page, anything that comes before it sits above, and anything that comes after it sits below, if you follow normal page flow, right? Now, a paragraph does the same thing, but the paragraph tag indicates to me that this is a paragraph. The div tag I can use for anything, and generally that is to be avoided. So what we saw as a matter of practice is that a lot of designers, and I was one of them, right? We would create constructs on the page. For example, I would create a div and I would put an ID on it and say menu or navigation or nav or something like that. And then they got to the point with HTML5, it's like, well, everybody does a div and calls it nav. Why don't we just create a tag called nav? So that's the mindset behind this. So they took a lot of things that people were doing as convention and turned them into tags with HTML5. And that's what you're going to see here in this list. So this is not a complete list of HTML5 tags, but it's pretty close to complete. And there are a few on here, and I would challenge you guys to find them, that are actually deprecated. Right? So ones that they thought were going to be part of the standard, you got to remember the book came out before the standard was approved, and then eventually did not become part of the standard. Like I said, I would challenge you to find them if you want got a little extra time on your hands. But look at some of the tags here, a lot of which did exist before. So like the anchor tag, the hyperlink tag, that's been around a long time. That's how we link from document to document, either through text or an image or some other sort of effect. But then notice some of these that they've added here. So they got an address tag. Yep, that's real. Abbreviation tag. Yep, that's real. And you may have like really briefly touched upon it in Web 1. Just so you know, it's an abbreviation. See, and this is the semantics of it, right? If I, let's say, work for the Central Intelligence Agency, right? I could put an ABBR tag around CIA, and I know it's an abbreviation. So the browser can read it as such and treat it in a different way. Not only that, but I could style to it, and I could write JavaScript to it as well. So if I, like every abbreviation that's on my document has the tags around it, I can programmatically do things with it. Like, for example, if the CIA abbreviation, if I hover over it, maybe I could throw a pop-up up that says Central Intelligence Agency and provide a, you do all sorts of crazy things. But by doing that and following those rules, and think about the meaning of the tag is important too. It designates what the contents are. Now, in terms of the world that we live in now, we live in a Google world, right? It's like, Alexa or Google or whatever, buy me a pizza. So that type of technology, that type of intelligence is really actuated by the fact that we follow these types of rules. So the reason to not use divs for everything is to give semantic meaning to your content so that we can enable higher end functionality and programmability, more importantly, to take our web pages from being something that just contains static, we look at it content like a piece of paper, and changing it into something that does something, which is really what we expect from the web, right? We don't expect to just look at something, we expect it to do something. All right, so if you go through these, I'm clearly not going to demonstrate all these, you can read about them. If there's some that you've never heard of, you can read up on them yourself. There's some that we will be working with pretty extensively. And there's some that are, like the embed tag. Yes, that still works, but that's really kind of deprecated by definition, which is kind of interesting. But that's a tag that in the old days we would have to use if we wanted to put flash on a page or a video on a page. So we don't have to do that anymore. You know what you do now to put a video on a page? You use the video tag. Oh my God, I mean, the video and the audio tags alone were worth the price of HTML5, which is free. But that was a huge step forward because what happened is they built right into the engine for the browser the ability to play video and audio without a plugin. In the old days, we'd have to make sure we had the plugin and we'd have to embed the content. Another thing that's pretty important is this concept of attributes. All right. Remember I was talking about how in the old days we would just create divs, we would just give them IDs, and a lot of times it was repetitive. So for example, I might create a container or a wrapper for a page, right? Div, ID, wrapper. And we still kind of do that. But we might also have the ability to add not only IDs but classes. And I want you to notice real carefully there that they're intermingling the use of single quotes and double quotes. And you can still do that. You have a preference, go with it. Why do they allow for both in programming languages? For nesting. That's exactly right. So that gives you the capability of putting a set of single quotes inside of a set of double quotes if necessary. In the original drafts of HTML5, they were actually omitting the quotes altogether for attributes. Confused a lot of people. So they went back to, enforcing the use of quotes. One thing that's interesting about divs and or IDs and classes, folks, IDs, only one object on a page can have an ID. Classes, multiple objects can have it, and you can also assign multiple classes to an object. It doesn't have to be just one. All right. There's different types of attributes, and anything that's added inside of a tag like this, where you see like an ID equals and then the quotes, that's an attribute. It's something we're adding to the tag. And there's a few different kinds. There's a kind that you see above, where we give it a name, equals, and give it a designation. Or you have some of these like Boolean attributes, and these are kind of weird, right? Because these are probably not things that you've worked with. I would say that probably the only ones that you worked with were maybe checked and maybe selected when you were learning how to do HTML forms, right? Like you might have checkbox, input type checkbox, and add a little Boolean attribute set that says checked. So when the page loads up, that box is pre-checked, right? And that's a Boolean attribute. And there's a number of those. And that's one of those little things, like if you were really working on the certification, that's one of those things that always tricks people. Because some of these Boolean attributes have multiple ways of presenting themselves. For example, you could say checked equals checked. Like right down here. See this? Or you can say checked with empty quotes. Or you can just say checked. And guess what? They all work. Something like a multiple choice question would be like, they'd have all three of those, and then it would be checked equals true. You're like, well, that sounds like the right one. Wrong. Right? So these are kind of interesting little things. So there's a number of these Boolean attributes. This is not all of them, but these are some of the more common ones that are out there. Very often they're used for things like forms, and sometimes they're actually used for triggering features within applications. So what would you suppose that read-only does? Yeah, and you guys in unison said that. Yeah, pretty much you can't change the contents of whatever it is you're dealing with. So what would that be? Maybe a text box where you pre-fill the text? Just as it... Are all of these Boolean? That's actually an attribute. That's a separate type of attribute. Yeah, and that you're referring to like a form control. So you could say input type hidden. Yeah. And you can actually make certain things not appear. Now the question is, why would you have a form element that's not visible?
Well, that would be like, I know, for instance, I'd be in a case where I didn't want to, blind it, so to speak. I didn't want that option line or whatever I was working with. I didn't want it lifeline. I wanted it to be lights.
Right. That would be one scenario. The other scenario, that's exactly what. Yeah, you use hidden information on pages to push data most often. Um, a really good example, like if you are, let's say, doing online shopping and you're filling out a form, you say add to cart, you increase your quantity, and it just kind of automatically does stuff. You're not thinking, okay, well, how are they calculating shipping? Well, somewhere there's hidden form fields that say what the shipping weight is, what the dimensional weight is, in other words, the height, width, and length in a girth, so that they can calculate the shipping. You don't need to see that information. You don't need to see the height, length, and width, and the shipping weight. Well, maybe, but you don't need to see them in order for the application to process the information. So sometimes you do pass information that's hidden or read only. You don't want people like changing the shipping weight, right? Well, I'll just change that from 20 pounds to 1 pound and save myself a whole lot of shipping money, right?
Wouldn't something like JavaScript or something, wouldn't another approach be like you could have JavaScript or
Yeah, there's numerous different ways to make something like that happen,
well,
but
but
that's one technique basically.
in the example you got, would that be like a situation where you want, where you're having HTML5 manual posts in there, or trying to understand why you get it?
Well, I'm going to say it is so highly dependent on so many different factors. It depends on really the depth of your application. If you were really running a real e-commerce application, chances are all those components would be database driven. So somewhere there would be a database entry that would say those components. If you were doing a more simplistic application, you might embed that stuff in a hidden fashion on a page because it's simpler than doing a database tie-in. So now, another thing that's kind of interesting here, they do have a little bit of a reference guide here as to some attributes. Remember, these are things that we add to tags that you guys may have never seen before. In fact, I would wager that most of this stuff, maybe with the exception of style, ID, well, some things on here you have not seen before or used. And we will be using some of these things in this class. Like, just for example, wow, draggable? Yeah, you can add that as an attribute to an HTML element, meaning that if somebody clicks on it, they can click and drag and move it around the screen. Now, of course, you have to code for it, but we are going to be doing drag and drop, and you're going to see that it's not that difficult once you get the concepts to ramp that up to do a whole lot of things. And you see that now in a lot of applications where you can drag and drop files in, or you can take one thing on the screen and move it somewhere else. It's not that big of a deal to code for it. One of the fun little exercises later in the book is we're going to create a little game where you like shuffle numbers around and it's all drag and drop. It's a pretty simple little exercise. I've had a few students that after they learned how to do that actually created video games using the same approach. One of them pretty sophisticated, and as we go through the course a little bit later, I'll show you some of the work from other students, hopefully as an inspiration. A couple of them even got their work published, which is pretty exciting. And I'll tell you what, if you walk into a job interview and you have like a game that you created that works in a browser, doors open for you folks when you can do stuff like that. So sometimes it's worth doing a little bit of extra work to get to that point. All right. Another thing that was happening in XHTML was the fact that they had this little conundrum, right? You guys know the BR tag for doing line breaks. When XHTML came around, they had the rule, because of XML, that any tag that you would open, you needed to close. So what do you do with a tag that normally doesn't have a closing? They came up with what they called self-closing tags, where you see the line break tags with the slash inside. And there's still a few tags that you can do that with, and an HTML5 does not care which approach you use. If you see a BR with a backslash in it, chances are it's a hangover or leftover from XHTML. Here's the interesting thing. If you ever encounter an XHTML document that you need to like revamp or update, you can just go right to the top of the document, change the doc type to doc type HTML, and it's an HTML5 document just like that. Just that simply. Anything that works in XHTML will work in HTML5 perfectly without changing a thing. Now, the validator might yell at you a little bit, saying that you don't need that closing tag in there, but it still works. It'll give you messages like that. All right, so you'll see a bunch of tags that were self-closing in that fashion. Here's an example when we get to the point where we're writing some JavaScript that when you use a script tag, that one never really was self-closing. So even though you don't put anything in between it, and you're pointing to an external file, you still need to have closing on it. The general rule of thumb is make sure any tag you open is closed and make sure they're nested properly, right? If I put in a paragraph tag and then inside of it put a bold tag, I better close that bold tag before I close the paragraph. That's what I mean by nesting. If you start to break that, whenever you start to break those simple rules, that's when the browser can go into what they call quirks mode. And all the browsers have it. And what quirks mode means is like, well, you wrote your own CSS and JavaScript, but we're going to do whatever we want now because you don't know how to follow the rules. And that's why you have to validate your documents. And that sounds really silly and it makes you chuckle, but that's the truth. And that's why people get pages that don't behave the same between browsers because of those issues. So our hope is to avoid those things. All right. So some tags that they developed, and there's probably a few in here that you haven't used as well, also are what we call void elements, meaning that are not really intended to have content inside of them. The line break is one of them, right? The point of that is go to the next line, right? You're not putting anything inside. All right, so this is a list of those commands or tags if you want to look at them that way. One that I will encourage you guys to experiment with, and I know some of you have already, is this tag, which I do find very useful, especially when working with mobile. It's a WBR tag, and what that tag does is it's an optional line break if necessary. Now, if you've ever worked with mobile and you start scaling things down, and sometimes things don't like scroll at the right spots, you can force in where it will switch to the next line manually rather than let the browser decide. So it only kicks in if you need it. All right, another interesting thing with HTML5 that's one that you'll probably explore when you get into higher levels of application development is what we call Expando attributes. And you can see the author here calls them author-defined attributes, meaning you can create your own attributes for tags. So you don't have to use the ones that are pre-created. Now, there are some catches with it. Like, for example, the one catch is that you preface it with that. So if you're creating something that's going to pass information, now why would you do this? Because you're creating a custom application that requires very specific type of input, and then you write JavaScript usually, or C# code or something like that, that will look for those attributes and then pull that data in to do something special for your application. This is definitely higher level stuff, folks. Chances are that you would write it from scratch just off the top of your head is slim to none. But I do want to throw in one really kind of additional interesting thought here. Because HTML5 is built on top of XML, and XML is a language in which you can actually create your own tags, It is possible in HTML5 to create your own unique tags that are not predefined and still have them work on your page. If you guys are ever curious about that, I'll do a little demonstration on it. So that's a possibility that you can ponder. And actually, some of the new tags that are in the draft version of HTML6, which are already working in 5, came from that background. Because all it takes in order to make something render on a page is that you put it into your CSS and say display block, and it will show up on your page. Kind of interesting. You guys know how to add comments to your pages, right? You've done that. What should you put in your comments? Your life story, right? Well, one thing that's kind of interesting here is they throw in this range of comments here that really are comments that were designed to work with the idiosyncrasies of Internet Explorer. And if you look at the syntax of this, and they explain it here in the book, that it's all set inside of comment marks so it doesn't render, first of all. But there's a special language that only Internet Explorer can read. Basically, we're probing the browser for its version number, and then based upon its version number and knowing its quirks, we can actually write different code, either JavaScript or CSS or both, to address that browser's issues. And yes, as we were transitioning to HTML5, you look at some web pages and they would have a whole listing like this. It's like, okay, if it's Internet Explorer 8, then we'll throw this CSS at it because that one screws up the padding. And then if it's Internet Explorer 7, oh my God, we got this other CSS because that one, and people would sit there for a long time and write this stuff. The hope now is that you don't have to do any of this, but you should be aware of it because you will encounter it in legacy documents. Okay, so this is something to know. I wouldn't worry a lot about coding in this fashion now. You should really be coding for straight HTML5 without considerations of what browser it's going to. Let the Internet Explorer people finally upgrade. All right. Let's get down to the structure of a page. We kind of were looking at this earlier inside of Visual Studio, but the very base level structure of a page should contain this: the doc type, the HTML tags, the head, and the body section. Generally speaking, whatever is in the head section of the document is things that are directives to the browser. Where to find the style sheet, the meta tags, the JavaScript files, and like a smattering of other things. It should not contain content. One thing I see is a really common problem with beginning web page developers is that they'll put like their navigation and their headings and stuff up in the head section. Wrong. Visible content on the page should all go in the body. You guys got that? All right. So that's one thing that I see often at the beginning when people are starting out. All right. I think you guys know a lot of these things. There is a whole host of special characters too that we have available, and one of the things that happened over the years is we would try to get certain types of characters onto the page. So like conundrum, early web developers, right? How do I display a less than sign using HTML, right? Or a greater than, right? Because if I do that, then it thinks it's a tag and I can't get it on the page. So they have to come up with these special codes that used to be all in numeric fashion, and these related directly to ASCII key codes. So, and in the more primitive versions of this, in the initial drafts of HTML, you would actually have to know the key codes rather than the numbers for them. So you'd have to write it out in binary or hex. And then they converted it to numbers, and then they came up with this whole table. In fact, you can go out to the web and just search character codes for HTML, and there are literally hundreds of them to generate all sorts of things. These are probably some of the more popular ones. So greater than, less than, ampersand, copyright, trademark. And then probably the one you'll use the most will probably be the non-breaking space. That's the one where you can force space into the document where normally you cannot. In HTML, one space will render in text, two will not. That's when you have to throw in the non-breaking space. Okay, so HTML ignores white space within the code itself. All right, that gets us through the first lesson here in the chapter, folks. And the next section talks about a technology that was actually developed by Microsoft called an inline frame. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we are just about out of time here in the classroom, but I will say that the iframe tag is a really useful little tool. It really stems from this previous technology that has now been completely deprecated called frames and frame sets. You guys ever heard of those? Yeah. Well, in the old days, they had this concept, right? Like if you look at, let's say Blackboard as an example, and you look at the structure of the page, they noticed very early on that people were following design patterns. Why? Because it makes sense, right? The design patterns for web pages really stem from print media. Why? Long time ago, they figured out when somebody picked up a newspaper or a magazine that it's probably a really good idea that if something's important, it should be in large text. Or if there's a title, it should be at the top. Or if there's auxiliary information, it should be in a sidebar. And the main content should probably go in the middle somewhere. And we probably shouldn't make it too wide. We should probably make it columns. So that's why you see these patterns that develop in web design. And we've mimicked that in the web. Why? Because it works. Very, very simply. So when we start to translate that into web pages, we often see at the top of a page, either horizontally or maybe on the left sidebar or the right sidebar, menus. In fact, a lot of web pages will have both, sidebar menus and top menus. The prevailing standard these days really is a horizontal menu just below the heading information. But usually you'll see heading, titles, and things like that at the top, auxiliary information on the side, perhaps navigation. So when we were designing pages, we were like, well, since that part always repeats and the sidebar always repeats, why every time I hit the sidebar or go to a different page, should the whole page have to redraw? Right? So they came up with this concept of frames where each portion of the page was actually its own web page, and it would load as a collection or a frame set of pages. So you would go to the home page and it would load the top part as a separate page, sidebar as a separate page, and the content as a separate page. And then whenever I would click on a link, all that would change is the stuff in the middle. Great idea, right? Because it would save bandwidth when we lived in a dial-up world, right? And people were connecting at like 14.4, or if you're lucky, maybe, 36K or something like that. And even if you had a 56K modem, you never really got up to that speed. So it was very, very, very slow. And any way that we could save bandwidth was very advantageous. So they came up with that approach. The problem was that because every part of the page was its own page, it was possible that you might go to Yahoo or Google and type in a search, and then you end up on one of the pages without the rest of the structure. So it ended up being that it only worked if you had a controlled point of entry. Now guess what? This approach is still heavily used, but only when there's controlled point of entry. So really it's kind of been deprecated because the language isn't supported anymore, but it can work. Microsoft's interesting solution was, well, if we're getting rid of all this frame set stuff, maybe we can come up with our own little frame thing. And what iframe, this tag, does is it allows you actually to inject a different web page inside of another. Now the thought is, why on earth would I want to do that? Well, the reason you might want to do that is it allows you to do some things you can't do otherwise. So for example, if I had a static page, but I wanted to show the scores from the NFL live, well, I'm not going to sit there and know how to interface with their database that puts out the live scores, but I could put in an iframe that just pulls their page directly into mine, and there you go. Let the user beware, they have no clue. So it's actually a very useful way to allow, perhaps somebody to change contents on a page by changing a page that they can't really mess up too much. I'll give you a really quick little example. A number of years ago, I had students working on this website here. for a local business. So this was built by Gateway students. And it looks like they removed the page. But they had a page on here that was a for sale page. And really all that for sale page had on it was the whole structure of the page and then an iframe in the middle. And the iframe held, or it would bring in a Google Doc. So whenever the guy had like a snowblower to sell or something, he could just go into the Google Doc, drop in a picture, type in a description, it would show up on the web page. He didn't know anything about HTML, but it enabled that functionality. So that, folks, is going to be the end of the lecture for tonight, and I'm sorry we didn't get to do more hands-on, but next week what I'm going to ask you guys to do so that we can save some of this process in the classroom is I want you, if possible, to read through the materials and maybe listen to the videos, that's really up to you, and even try the exercises. And when we get to class, I would like to focus more on the coding and working through the exercises and then whatever questions you have as opposed to doing a lecture. Because we are in what we call a blended format, which really means that in a traditional classroom we would have 4 hours to work, not 2. So for me, the most efficient way to handle that is you do the lecture and the readings on your own, we come to class and we code. So if you guys are all on board, that's what we're going to do next week. So we'll come in and if you guys have had any problems with Chapter 2, which I don't anticipate, the only exception might be which project template you use. But aside from that, I will anticipate not too many problems, and then we will start digging into Chapter 3. And the reason I want to kind of be aggressive about our progress is I don't know if you've looked at the book, but we're going through all the chapters, and plus have auxiliary materials on top of it. And the only way to accomplish that is by getting the pace moving quickly. All right? So I'll see you guys next week.